Hey fearsome friends. I apologise for the last story in the last episode not being finished. I don't know what happened there. I've included it in this episode though, so no worries. Now for 12 allegedly true encounters with creeps. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm. Because it's time to let your nightmares in. So this was a couple of months ago in December 2021, and I was at an event about 40 minutes away. It was an Art Basel in Miami, and I went to an after party that my friend was hosting. I live in Broward County, and I was drinking, so I decided not to drive home that night. My friend, being nice, ordered a Lyft for me, and this was about 3 a.m. Everything was business as usual in terms of getting a Lyft drunk in the middle of the night to take you home. When around halfway into the trip, the driver, who was a very large man, pulled off at an exit which wasn't mine and down into a grassy ditch. Admittedly, I wasn't paying much attention up until this point, but after realizing what was happening, I began assertively saying, "Where are we? What's going on?" But he just sat there breathing heavily, giving no response to any of my questions. The doors were locked and I kept looking to my right, but all that was there was a vacant lot full of trees. I was convinced someone was about to run up and grab me out of the back seat, and I started crying. However, as soon as I started with the tears, he put the car into reverse, drove out of the ditch and up the exit ramp at full speed. Throwing it then into drive, he hit 85 to 90 miles an hour to my exit. At this point, I was just hoping he didn't flip the car or slam into a wall, he was going that fast. He took the exit and sped all the way into my neighbourhood, running the red lights. Once we made the turn, skidding into my street, I screamed to let me out, and that this was my house, mine being at the other end, and he unlocked the doors so I could jump out. I got out though, and you wouldn't believe it. But he got out too and proceeded to pull down his pants and take his penis out. I ran towards my house, and the last thing I yelled to him was that I was going inside and grabbing my gun, and if he was still outside, I was going to shoot his dick off. I got to my house safely, locked the door, then called my friend to tell him what had just happened. I asked him to screenshot me the driver information, but when he did this, it was gone. I have a Lyft app and I tried to call customer services, but it turned out there was no number. They made me text back and forth about what had just happened for about 45 minutes, and I demanded that a representative call me. Someone finally did, and they said I could call the police, but they said I couldn't share the driver information and that they deleted the entire thread. It just disappeared. I couldn't believe it. Some freak now has my address after I'd reported a threat, but refused to give me any information to actually report him to the police. It was now about 5 a.m. when Lyft dropped my call and erased all contact with me. I should have called the police looking back, but to be quite honest, calling them in South Florida when an immediate continuing threat is not in place is more hassle than it's worth, speaking from experience. So to conclude, do not use Lyft. They're unsafe and they don't care at all about their riders' safety. Also, if that creepy asshole is on here, I will still blow your dick off if you come to my house. I was just informed that the man that I saw whilst I was asleep might have been the Hat Man. I'll tell you about my dream first. I live in a small college dorm room, and my roommate and I both have lofted beds on either side of it. One night last semester during the fall, after a night full of dreaming, I woke up at about 5 in the morning. I was facing away from the wall, where I saw a man in a black suit and fedora, just standing facing the corner of the room. I immediately froze as I watched him, just standing there completely still. He had to have been pretty tall too, because I saw a good portion of him from my lofted bed. After staring for what seemed like forever, he then quickly turned his head all the way around and looked directly at me. I'm pretty sure he did anyway, as he seemed to have no face. It was at this point I assumed that I really woke up, except I don't remember waking up. I just remember flinching at his sudden movement and turning to face the wall, becoming completely paralyzed with fear. Normally when I have a nightmare, the effect of the dream wears off and I can go back to sleep pretty quickly. But I was so terrified, I couldn't imagine going back to sleep. After about half an hour of not being able to calm down and convince myself that there wasn't still a man in a suit behind me, I slid my hand under my pillow to get my phone and call my partner. They answered after the ringing had apparently woke them up, and I told them what had just happened. Still terrified, they helped me relax just enough to go back to sleep. But when my alarm for 8 a.m. class woke me up at 7, I was still too scared to turn around, that I skipped class completely. Whatever happened though, whether it was a dream or not, it was that vivid it kept me in bed until the sun came up, and my roommate convinced me there was no one else in the room. After that, I just told anyone who asked about it that it was one of the worst nightmares I've ever had. Today I entered a conversation about dreams with a group of my friends, and when I told the story, a friend of mine quietly told me, "You saw the Hat Man." I was confused, so I asked who he was. My friend then went on to explain that the fact that I hadn't previously known of the Hat Man means it was more likely that I did see him. They explained that the Hat Man is said to be an entity who often appears to people, most commonly children, during sleep paralysis and nightmares. He wears either a black top hat or fedora and has no face, and when he appears he just stands still. He might move slightly before disappearing, but there are no instances that I've found where he has caused anyone harm. It's still so scary that someone who I saw in my room has visited so many other people. I was 14 at the time of this incident, and I was at home with my brother, grandma, and baby cousin. My brother had invited some girl over, then introduced us to her. She looked normal enough, but seemed a bit nervous, so my grandma made conversation with her and said that if her and my brother needed anything, to just let her know. My grandma told me to stay upstairs, to allow my brother and the girl privacy downstairs. But of course, me being the nosy little sister, I wanted to know everything, especially about this new girl my brother had brought home. So I snuck down the hall quietly and looked over the banister, and I could see the girl looking outside into the backyard, and she was asking my brother questions like, "Who else lives here? Is this your house? It's so nice." Hearing the conversation, I decided to heed my grandma and go back inside my room, when I then began to listen to music, feeling the urge to look outside my window. As I did, I could see a 2000 Chevrolet Impala parked outside our driveway. The door was wide open, and it appeared to be a man leaving our house with all of our tech items and packing them into the car. The feeling of dread came over me, and I said to myself, "What is going on?" Then the sound of loud talking was heard downstairs, and my brother said, "Please, you don't have to do this." "You'll just let us leave if you know what's best," the girl responded. I hurried and ran quietly to my grandma so I could let her know what I'd seen and heard downstairs, but she didn't understand the severity of what I was telling her and began to laugh, which made me kind of upset, because our lives could be in danger. I then heard tires screeching and saw the Chevrolet Impala speeding down the street, when I called out to my brother and he said, "Huh?" in a distraught voice. "What's going on? Who was that man outside?" I asked. He didn't reply, so I walked downstairs to see my brother shaking his head in belief, looking at where our TV used to be. The police came shortly after due to my grandma calling them, and we were later informed that my brother and the girl had met for the first time that day from a dating app, and of course they met at our house. the girl had set up the entire robbery. She was just the decoy until her actual boyfriend came to rob us. But this next part is what really makes my blood run cold. The guy who'd robbed us had held my brother at knife point and told him that if he didn't comply, he would stab all of us as a punishment for him getting in the way. The cops asked my brother to give a description, but he couldn't. Later on that same day, we heard a truck pull up outside the house. Whoever it was yelled, threw a glass bottle and drove off. I'm not sure if it was the same man who'd robbed us, but it terrified me. I'm just grateful nothing actually happened to my brother or my family. And it just goes to show you, you can't trust everyone. I was 7 years old and my aunt and uncle were having a party for my cousin. The whole family was there, plus many friends and a few neighbours. And growing up, all of my cousins and I were very close. They were like the brothers and sisters I never had. So needless to say, that when we were together we were inseparable. The neighbourhood they lived in was pretty big, with old colonial houses up and down the streets. It was a beautiful place, and there was only one other kid that lived nearby, who was a girl named Krista, and she was 8. I had met her on several occasions, but I was always with my cousins when we'd walk to her house to play. Her house looked like an antique store, with dozens of porcelain dolls and big French furniture throughout. Krista was an only child, like me, but she had almost every toy imaginable. So I definitely didn't mind going to her house, as it felt like I was in a toy store. Plus we had always seemed to get along. So on the day of the party, we were all outside, running around and having a blast. Or at least I thought we all were. When at some point, Krista asked Georgia, my cousin's friend from school, if we wanted to walk down to her house. I immediately agreed, as like I said, I always enjoyed going to her house. And when we arrived, her mum and Gran were there. So we said hi and then proceeded up the stairs. Once up there, she started talking to Georgia and I about how she had something really cool to show us. Of course we were interested about what it was, so she opened a door that I assumed was a closet, but was actually a little bonus room off of her bedroom, which was just filled with stuff. As a little kid, I was more than curious, so we walked in, and it was bigger than a closet. We started looking around, waiting for her to show us what was so important, when all of a sudden Krista left the room, shut the door and locked us in there. I thought she was just pulling a prank on us at first, but then she started to talk. Krista started telling us that we were mean, taking up all of our cousins' time. She continued by saying that she is her best friend and that she will not be replaced. Georgia and I just looked at each other in complete shock, and were more than frightened. She started telling us she was going to keep us locked up forever, and we had no idea what we were going to do or how we were going to talk to this girl into letting us out. I don't remember exactly what we said, but we of course tried to talk her into letting us out. Now at this time I wasn't sure how long we'd been at her house, but thank goodness we had family that paid attention, because the next thing we heard was my 2 cousins, Liza and her sister Nicole, yelling at Krista. They heard us then, and they asked what the heck we were doing in there. Of course Krista told them we were just playing, and she was just joking with us, but we knew better. After my cousins demanded her to let us out, we immediately left Krista's house and made our way back to the party. We told my cousin what had happened, and she couldn't believe it. This girl locked me and Georgia in a room because she was jealous. Needless to say, neither of my 2 cousins hung out with her after that, and they moved away about a year later anyway. Sometimes I often wonder what had happened to her, and if her creepy jealous actions ever escalated into something bigger. I, a 24-year-old female, used to be painfully shy when I was a kid. I was around 15 to 16 when this happened, with a few small groups of friends that I was always around. My first day of sophomore year, I met this guy. Let's call him Seth. And he was around 18 to 19 at the time. He was in one of my classes and seemed a little strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time because he seemed really nice. Finally, it was time for my favourite period, which was lunch, as it was reserved for my favourite people, and they were two boys who graciously accepted awkward 13-year-old me after a dramatic move to my dad's home. One of the boys was actually my best friend and first boyfriend, who I'll call Jay for this story. We were really close, and I trusted him more than anyone else. Then my other friend, called Harry, was in the same class with me where I met Seth. So I sat at our table and we began to start comparing teachers, when Seth randomly joined our table. I figured that he was one of their friends, so we just continued on as normal. After a few weeks, I started getting a little creeped out by Seth though, as he seemed to be everywhere I went in the school, and was always stood way too close. If I asked him to step back, he would point out other guy friends who stood closer, and it was usually the same two guys he would use as examples. But for context, I'm in a wheelchair, and he was very tall, so my head was the same level as his area. I eventually found out that he had seen what my school login was, and had saved it to his computer. Now I didn't want to immediately freak out and report him, so I decided that I was going to just ask him to delete it. He said he would, and that was the end of that. But as the months went by, Seth just got worse. The class we had was a film class, where the students would go out during the period in groups to do the projects independently. This was very scary for me though, because he would immediately put me in his group. I would politely decline until we were put in pairs, and he would always try to get me to go film with him in the back fields behind our school. The way he would suggest it made me so scared that I would refuse to leave the room. My teacher was amazing though, and didn't force anyone to go out, so Seth would end up going alone and I would do the edit. While Seth was out, I decided to see if he'd deleted my login, and he hadn't. He had at least 20 other logins saved on this document, and I was so scared that I decided to report it to my counsellor, but my counsellor was a complete idiot, and told Seth that a girl in his class had reported him. I found this out because the next day when Seth came to lunch, he started accusing me and seemed really angry. I denied it, of course, and Jay and Harry stuck up for me. But it was shortly after this that I found out that neither of my friends actually knew Seth, and he'd only known of me when he'd joined our table. My counsellor deemed my concerns to not be important enough to notify our teacher or police, so I guess it wasn't serious enough to warrant anything outside the school, and they didn't even notify my dad. After everything happened with the report, he went back to being creepy, but much worse. Every day he would try to convince me to go somewhere with him behind our school, and it had gotten to the point that he was trying to tell me I had to. He would make up excuses for us to go somewhere alone. I didn't tell anyone about what was happening besides the school and later on my teacher, because at the time I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. I think my friends suspected something was going on though, because they started walking with me to classes when they could. I ended up telling my teacher what was going on, and he immediately assigned seats and spoke to a girl in my class to see if I could permanently join her group. Seth graduated at the end of that year and decided to resurface in my email inbox when I was about 18, but I blocked him immediately. I just returned from a walk around the neighbourhood, when my fiancé and I had just seen the most peculiar thing. Now there is a neighbourhood cat that will sometimes follow us on walks, and tonight was no different. As we were turning back to head home though, we noticed a man up the street was walking with his German Shepherd in our direction. The cat froze on someone's driveway, giving clear signs that she was not okay with the man and his dog approaching her. But the man carried on regardless. We hung around, wondering what he was doing, as he commanded his dog to sit in front of her, only a couple of feet away. They both just stared at her, and the man was silent as the dog was growling at her. She hissed, and I had a very bad feeling. I didn't want to leave her until he'd left, but he continued to stand there with his dog, almost to intimidate the cat. My fiancé then told him to leave the cat alone, but he didn't turn once to look at us. Instead, he kept staring at the cat. We waited a few more minutes, and my fiancé repeated, "Leave that cat alone." The man very slowly backed off, said nothing to us, which I find incredibly weird, crossed the street and walked back in the direction that he'd come. We both felt he was up to no good, especially since he'd not said a word to us, not even a mind your business or I'm not hurting the cat. Is this not odd? It's almost as if we weren't there or something, because he wasn't weirded out by us watching him or anything. It's just weird. This story happened a few years ago when I was in my early 20s and was studying in Paris, France. I was going home from uni, and I usually took a short bus ride, then walked the rest of the way. However, that day I felt slightly uncomfortable, as I could sense some guy was looking at me intensely. I was used to unpleasant, unsolicited gazes, but this time it felt beastly. It's hard to explain why, but I felt like prey being stalked. I decided to get off the bus a few stops early, as I wanted to avoid him, and I also didn't want him to see where I usually got off. So like I'd learned in the movies, I waited until someone else had pressed the stop button, and waited until the last moment to stand up and leave. I didn't notice him getting off the bus, and just as I was feeling the relief of having escaped an uncomfortable situation, I looked over my shoulder, and there he was a few meters behind. I walked into a shop, took my phone out, and pretended to be taking a call. Then when I couldn't see him anymore, I exited and made my way home as fast as I could. I kept looking back into the busy street. I zigzagged, crossed at every crossing, and finally I convinced myself that him getting off at the same stop as me was just a coincidence. When I reached my building, I looked back one last time, and he was still there with his alarming gaze on me, smirking. I ran up to my apartment, climbed the stairs 4 at a time, and when I reached the top floor, I squeezed through my door, locked it, and froze. Suddenly, my intercom rang. Don't ask me why I picked it up, as I regretted it the moment I did. But I could hear the opposite flat intercom ringing as well. He had pressed all of the buttons one by one, hoping someone would open up. And now he knew my name. "Gabrielle?" he said. I felt like a deer in headlights, completely frozen with fear. "Open the door, please. I just want to talk to you," he said, pleading. Somehow I couldn't move or speak. Then he continued. "Come to the window. Look at me and you'll see I'm not a bad guy." Something then clicked as I realized he wanted me to come to the window so he could see which apartment was mine. I wasn't going to make that mistake, so I hung up and was in complete shock. I waited by the door without moving for what seemed hours, and when I finally managed to calm myself, I called my long-distance boyfriend, who told me to call the police immediately. Why didn't I call the police straight away? I don't know. Today it would have been the first thing that I'd do in this situation, but the fear of making a big deal out of something not important overrode me. What an idiot I was. I called my best friend instead, as I didn't want to feel alone. I told her all about what was happening, and after a while I felt better, safe, and even started laughing. Then suddenly the intercom rang again. 2 hours had passed since I'd come home, so I answered. "Gabrielle," said the voice. "Open up, please." It was him again. I still remember the chills I felt as I realized he'd been there this whole time. I was silent, petrified, and he was silent too, but I could sense his trepidation. "Gabrielle, let me in. I'm so thirsty," he said. "Just give me a glass of water." This broke the tension and I hung up, curled up in a corner, literally in the recovery position and terrified. I waited. I was scared to make a sound. I knew he couldn't hear me from the hall, but I was scared to even breathe. The intercom rang again, and again, and I didn't answer this time. I crouched on the sofa and fell asleep from exhaustion. Then I heard the intercom ring one more time in the middle of the night. I woke up in the morning, afraid to leave my apartment, so I called my dad, who came and picked me up. There was no one in the hall, but there was a note in my mailbox that read, "Gabrielle, I'm a nice guy. You should have opened up to me." We immediately went to the nearest police station and they listened, then of course told me that I shouldn't hesitate to call them if he came back. My dad called a locksmith to install a digicode on the building door the same day and wrote a message to each of my neighbours asking not to open the door to anyone they weren't expecting. Then my dad sat in the cafe in the front of my building with two of his friends every evening for more than a week. Thankfully, I never saw the stalker again, and after this whole incident, I used a different route to and from uni every day. I kept my phone tightly in my hand and looked back every few meters. Today I'm still very conscious of my surroundings, and I never answer the door if I'm not expecting anyone. So people, if you ever find yourself in any kind of uncomfortable situation, call the police. Don't be an idiot like me. Be safe, everyone. Now first off, I feel incredibly stupid saying this, but my front door was mistakenly left unlocked. Both myself and my boyfriend thought the other one had locked it when we'd come in, and I almost always double-check before bed to make sure. But this time I was running on 3 hours of sleep, and it had very unfortunately slipped my mind. That being said though, to make things clear, my boyfriend works nights, so he is almost always awake during the night and sleeps during the day. I work days, so my sleep schedule is nearly opposite. Every Saturday morning I load up our 2 baskets of laundry into my car and wash it at my mum's house, as she lives close to where I work, plus our apartment complex doesn't have a washer or dryer. I specifically do it every Saturday because it's the only day of the week I get out of work in the morning and have the time, so it works well. So that evening I called my boyfriend on my way home and talked with him as I drove, ending up getting the 2 of us Taco Bell for dinner. He came outside when I arrived at about 6 p.m. to help me carry everything in. And like I'd mentioned, we were both distracted by food and carrying everything that we'd forgotten to lock the door. Often I carry everything inside alone as he's usually still sleeping, so my routine was all messed up in my mind. We ate dinner, then went to our bedroom to lie down. He fell right back to sleep, but I was awake for a couple of hours playing my Switch. By about 8 p.m. I got up and put my Switch away, then passed out very soon afterwards. My boyfriend then got out of bed approximately an hour or 2 after I'd fallen asleep, and went into our computer room so he could play some games himself. I have no idea how I slept through all of this, but it's so horrifying to think about it. He said he'd heard a small knock on our door. Then immediately, a man walked into our house and into the living room. The computer room where my boyfriend was sitting was directly down the hallway from the living room, so he stood up out of his chair and started walking towards the man, loudly saying, "What the hell are you doing? Who are you?" Meanwhile, I was asleep in the bedroom, right off from the same hallway, and I vaguely remember hearing my boyfriend say, "What the hell are you doing?" But I thought he was just talking to our cat, so I passed out again. My boyfriend said the guy was wearing a face mask that was pulled down, and he was stumbling over his words, saying something along the lines of, I'm supposed to be here. They said to just knock and come in." My boyfriend told him to get out and that he had the wrong place. Then the guy backed off into the hallway of our apartment complex, then said something like, "They told me room 350 or something, but I couldn't find it. They wouldn't give me an exact address." My boyfriend threatened to call the police if he didn't leave right then, and thank goodness he left. But personally, I think he should have called the police regardless. But then, I'm not sure what good it would have done, to be honest. Now, I know I'm probably being completely paranoid, but I keep thinking about what if this man thought I was home alone, as my boyfriend used to work every Saturday night until quite recently. Our curtains in the bedroom were cracked, and he could have seen me sleeping in bed and thought I was alone. The way he was stumbling over his words, trying to come up with a reason he'd walked right into our apartment, just doesn't sit right with me at all, especially if he'd said they wouldn't give me an exact address. If that was the case, then why would he come directly to our door? My boyfriend didn't hear him trying random doors or jiggling our neighbours' handles to see if they were unlocked, as at night our complex is very quiet and we can hear whenever someone down the hall opens a door, etc. So it seems as if he'd come directly to our door. What if he knows my routine? I know he could have been genuinely telling the truth and was supposed to meet up with someone, but the whole thing has me so freaked out. How am I not going to overthink this in today's world as a woman? What if he hadn't even knocked but my boyfriend thought he had and it matched his story? I keep thinking about what if my boyfriend wasn't home. I would have slept right through this man opening our door, and who knows what he could have done. I like to think I'm normally very cautious, but I'm definitely going to only load up my laundry in my car when it's light outside, even if that means loading it up the day before. I feel so unsafe, and will be talking to my landlord about it. I know there's nothing he can do about it, but I would feel wrong not making him at least aware of the situation, in case it happens to someone else. Does anyone have any advice or precautions I should take? I just want to know if there's any red flags someone else might think of that I haven't. Of course now I will be checking 10 times per day if my damn door is locked, and will likely not be able to sleep without a weapon near me. Before I start, I'd like to explain something. 2 years ago, I lived in a house that had a terrace and a small parking lot that was 1 meter below said terrace, and my bedroom was upstairs, and the stairs had a door to them that could be locked. I live in the south of France, in the Pont Royal area, and everything was going well. I lived with my former father-in-law and my mother, and one evening I was playing Minecraft in my bedroom, when for no reason at all, I then looked to the left towards my window, and saw a man standing there wearing a balaclava and staring at my window. I could see an object in his hand, and completely terrified, I went to tell my mother and stepfather. They locked all the doors then, and we all went to bed. Needless to say, it took me a long time to get to sleep and forget about the man. Weeks went by, and then months, and it happened again. Only this time I was playing Among Us, and already constantly looking out of the window, paranoid I was going to see him again. But this time seeing him sent me into absolute fear, because I was home alone. I turned away from the window for about 10 seconds, and when I looked back suddenly, he was gone. Well, I told myself he was gone, but I was wrong. I then heard this loud noise at the front door, so quickly grabbed my phone, keys and my laptop in my bag, then opened the window and climbed out onto my terrace. I slipped down onto the parking lot, when I then heard another noise, then again, and I saw the guy, who I could see was holding a knife. I began to run until I reached my friend's house down the street, and being totally exhausted by this point from running, fortunately he opened up to me, and I told him everything. In the meantime, I called my mother in building security, and shortly after, I saw the same car make several turns and pass 4 times in front of my friend's house. The second time it passed, I recognized the man who was sitting in the passenger seat, and I could see not 1 person, but 4. 2 years since this incident, I obviously moved to a bigger city, but moreover to an apartment in a more quiet district, and my boyfriend often comes to see me now. Now, I have made posts detailing and analysing the behaviour of criminals and horrible people in my life that got a lot of traction, so I thought I would introduce you all to another guy I grew up with, who I will refer to as Ryan for the sake of simplicity and anonymity. So Ryan and I go way back, all the way to elementary school, but we're not close until my freshman year of high school, when he started dating a close friend of mine, and us and another friend formed a tight-knit group, and I became really close with Ryan. His girlfriend and one of my best friends, Ella, has had a not-so-easy childhood to say the least. She was the victim of a priest from when she was a baby into her early childhood, which made Ryan's behaviour all that more disgusting. We all thought he was the perfect man, the one true guy who always stood up for women openly and disposed those who performed sexual acts non-consensually. Unfortunately, by this age, I was familiar with too many gross guys, and he didn't seem like one of them whatsoever. He always asked for consent, wanted to help women dealing with sexual abuse, and was a proponent of women's rights. So how exactly did we end up with the threat of a restraining order and case of domestic violence? After a few years, I discovered his darker side, how he was quick to anger and how much he needed to be right. It was really frustrating to have conversations with him when he was so quick to anger and refused to listen to me. This was my junior year, and we all could feel a strain put upon our friends, as his behaviour seemed to be extra irrational going into our senior year. Ella and Ryan had broken up. Ryan was distraught and spent the next several months trying to get her back. It had come to light that the black eye she'd had a couple of months ago was actually from him. We were all shocked, as we'd never thought that him of all people would do this. This poor girl had 2 rapists under her belt already, and she didn't want to take this to court again, as it was extremely emotionally damaging and stressful. She wanted to just move on and not let him ruin her life. That anger I had seen slip out like a different person had inhabited him again, and he had been grabbing, slapping and hitting Ella for months behind closed doors, whilst we all loved him. Once he knew people knew what was going on, he began to lose it, screaming in an unbridled rage at random girls during school hours who he knew were aware of his deeds, accusing them of spreading false information. This began to tear apart entire friend groups, as people struggled to believe that this infamously good guy was actually a monster, and this so-called sexual advocate for women was forcing blowjobs on his girlfriend in public areas and punching holes in his drywall. She'd moved on, but he hadn't, and he'd show up to her house, where she would refuse to see him. He knew this, so he came back with a letter for her instead, and gave it to her father to give to her. Inside it was a rambling mess that attempted to gaslight Ella into believing that none of these assaults had ever occurred. I don't know why he thought that would work. I mean, she was there when it happened. Things got worse from there, though, as he began to notice that we were no longer friends, got upset and didn't understand why, when really it should be obvious. He would lash out and stare into people's eyes without saying anything, intimidating people. That weekend the school play was opening, and he was part of the crew. Whilst the cast was performing, he began to poke and corner a few girls into walls and yell at them at the top of his lungs, saying the most vile, disgusting, personal insults one could ever think of, and for no reason at all. He then did this to Ella too, and of course it disrupted the show. He then sped off to go sob in the bathroom. Then he was sent home for being a danger to others. They had to call his mum and warn her that he was being hostile, and to be prepared, but his parents had ignored his behaviour and just let him continue to go to school, even after this incident. He was obviously in need of treatment, and the next Monday we were all scared of him. During 6th period one day, he grabbed 2 of his pals and they left class and made their way into Ella's class. Both of these men are horrible people too, one of which I was close with in the past, but stopped talking to him because he obsessively sexually fantasized about me. And the other guy is now also a rapist. So you know something was about to go down. They stormed the classroom, and this man started blabbering nonsense and was cussing the teacher and Ella out. She was horrified, froze, then ran out of the door to the office crying and trying to find safety. This girl has severe PTSD, and he knew that. Then he stopped by another classroom after that and cussed out the teacher there, who had sent him home from the play the other night. I don't know how nobody had stopped him this entire time, and we were all sure he was going to be suspended. But no. He was back at school in his full-blown Joker era, dressed like a goddamn school shooter, always lurking and pacing and staring at people in a threatening way. His behaviour was increasingly hateful and driven by social rejection, and the anger he expressed wasn't just anger, but was like he was foaming at the mouth, red in the face and breathlessly screaming some of the most unrepeatable terrible things. Oh yeah, he also has guns, assault weapons that aren't locked up as they should be, and that he has trained with for years. I don't even recognise this man I used to adore, and I was left in shock, feeling completely unsafe and unsure of how he could have hidden his dark side, how I can trust anyone anymore. This was our breaking point, as we were completely terrified of him. He was targeting Ella's closest friends too, and would just sit across from us during lunch for no reason. He wouldn't talk, just look at us, and sometimes got really angry and hit the table, storming off. We told the counsellor everything we knew, most of which he was aware of, but some of which he wasn't, like the guns. We had a kid who was always yelling about how he was the victim, and how no one understood him, who would suddenly display serious physical violence and fits of rage. One day I went out for coffee with Ella and another girl, and we talked about how scary it had become to be at school with him. He knew where we lived, and he's shown up out of the blue at people's houses before. Public areas aren't even safe anymore either, because he simply doesn't care. I had this moment where I'd said, you know, right after someone snaps and does something horrible, everybody always says, how did nobody see this coming? And this is that moment. We can see it coming, and we have to say something. Ella's parents are pushing a restraining order, as he hasn't been disciplined by his parents or the school. He doesn't sit with us and watch us eat anymore, but is still around. This is all recent too, so this is where the story ends, except to say that one of the girls he had targeted, he'd pushed into a corner, and isn't always able to go to school now. He doesn't talk to people much anymore, and sometimes he aggressively prowls the hallways alone for no reason. Everyone fears talking to him or looking at him or getting in his path, and we don't know what he's going to do next. I don't know how to stop him. It is also worth mentioning that he frequently uses psychedelic drugs and other substances that we personally believe is what caused the initial psychotic break. Now we have a cabin that is remote, and it's where I stay for work. I'm always told not to go alone for safety reasons, as things can go wrong quickly and help is too far away. So on this trip, I went alone as usual, as I needed to get work done. I also needed time to get away from the city life, and getting out into the wild is a great way to reset, which is what I needed. My trip ended up taking a long time, and I got into the camp around 1:30 a.m. I stopped the truck, put on my headlamp, and went straight to the warehouse to get the generator going. Then I connected the power and the cabin lit up. There was a ton of snowfall, so I did my usual inspection to see if I could spot any tracks around the cabin, like wolves, moose, or humans, and thankfully I found nothing. So I headed into the cabin, lit a fire, and cooked myself a late meal. As you can imagine, being out there isn't any cell service, but I did download some movies on my phone to keep me occupied, as it helps me fall asleep. I eventually fell asleep at about 2:30 a.m, and beforehand had decided to add more logs to the fire, to make sure it lasted through the cold winter night. But as I was doing this, I heard someone or something walking on the deck towards the front door. You know that sound when snow is being crunched by a boot? That's what it was. I thought, weird. I didn't hear a vehicle pull in or anything. So I listened more just to be sure I was hearing it correctly. And I was then 100% sure there was someone standing outside my cabin. I got up from the chair where I was sitting and immediately looked out the window, moving then to the front door. I unlocked it, then looked towards the sound of the footsteps. I called out to see if anyone was there, but nothing. Well, whatever it is, it wants fear, and there's no way I'm giving it that, I thought. I closed the door and locked it to be sure. Then I stayed up for a little while longer to listen, but nothing. I thought to myself that maybe there's a marten, which are common critters around these parts. So I fell back to sleep, and the next morning I went out to check for tracks. There were prints, but there were some that I couldn't confirm were mine or someone else's. I'd forgotten to check the moment I'd got up, and had walked by there a few times that morning to use the bathroom. I've been back there with company as I do sometimes, and I stay up a little later than everyone else to listen for those footsteps again, but I've not heard them since. Where I'm from in the legend states, when alone in the wilderness, something will play tricks on you, and you're not supposed to respond, as its goal is to bring harm to you. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.